go ahead and introduce our speaker. She is Rowena Dasch, the Executive Director at the Neill-Cochran House. She's been the Executive Director there since the end of 2013. She holds an MA and a PhD in American Art from the University of Texas at Austin and an AB in Art and Archaeology from Princeton University. During her tenure at the Neill-Cochran House Museum, Rowena has focused on increasing the diversity of the displays, mounting a first ever curated exhibition of paintings, installing a didactic display of silver working methods, and overseeing annual exhibits in the museum's new upstairs gallery. Her day-to-day work covers all facets of the museum's operations and the historic properties preservation, including planning and implementing of major structural restoration project, annual fundraising, educational programming for adults and families, and collection management. I'm going to turn it over to Rowena, but when she's finished and you have questions, I just wanted to remind you to please type them into the chat, and then we will, I will read them to Rowena, and she can answer them for you. So without further ado, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Good morning, everybody. Give me 1 second because I thought I had my technology set and then I didn't. There we go. Thanks so much to the Powder Magazine for having me and for profiling the Neill-Cochran House Museum. I'm thrilled to be here. Saw a few of our Texas members on, so hi to Gray and Eileen, Mary Louise, Vereen, and Ellie. And anybody else who's on there whose names showed up as garbled and I didn't recognize you. I am the Executive Director of the Neill-Cochran House Museum. You can see our facade right there. And happy to share a little bit about our history with you. And then I'm going to focus much more on what we're up to today. But as you can see here, what you have on this screen, and I'm going to minimize all of these people so that I can actually see my maps. We are one of Austin's oldest residents. We were built in 1856. The city of Austin was founded in 1839. So we were about 17 years in, I guess you could say. And I won't go much into the history of Austin, but it was essentially, there was nothing there. It's kind of like establishing Washington, D.C. on a swamp, except we weren't a swamp. We were just nothing, open prairie land. And so when the earliest structures were really very rudimentary and temporary. And we were part of really the first building campaign that Austin saw in the 1850s. So what you have here is a image from 1887. So if we're doing the math, that's essentially 40 years after the city was founded. And this is actually the importance of this map to us is it's the very first time that our site shows up on a map because we were built so far into the countryside. We were really built as in a suburban estate. The site was originally 17.5 acres. So it wasn't big enough to have been kind of commercial farming. It was really more intended as a suburban estate. And you can see, I don't know if my cursor will show up, but you see the hills to the west of us, and right there, that's our site. And as you can see, in 1887, there was still very little around it. We were opened in 1962 as a museum, the first floor initially. The whole site has been open since the late 1970s, and we've had professional staff since 2005. So I guess we've hit 15 years of actual staff. We're also home to the only intact slave quarters that's still standing in the city. And you can see that building on the lower left here. It's that 2-story structure with the external staircase. Oh, I'm gonna have to use my cursor. There we go. We like to say that our most significant objects in our collection are our structures themselves. We are known for our Greek Revival structure and for the unusual way in which our building was completed, which was through rubble limestone. which was really unusual for a fine home. Typically, you saw that in sort of lower class structures as well as commercial buildings. So that's really where our emphasis lies in terms of the collection itself. However, that wasn't really true when we first opened as a museum. The idea that the NSCDA Texas had initially was that this would be an opportunity to share different periods of American history and decorative art styles with the public. And initially the public was seen as mostly Austinites, actually. So this is prior to a real focus on heritage tourism, which has developed in Austin, at least in terms of people really paying attention to it over the last 20 years. So the original collection objects came from members of the NSCDA Texas. And what you're seeing here on the left is the French parlor, which is mostly 19th century Rococo revival. And then the dining room on the right, which is primarily focused around the turn of the 19th century in England. In the 2000s, though, several things came to pass right around the same moment. The Cochran descendant most connected to the museum was ready to downsize. She and other members of her family had offered objects to the museum over the years, but as I say, the focus was really much more on different periods of time throughout American history and not so much on the lived experience on our site. And so as a result, recognizing the cost of storage, members of the board had never accepted those gifts. However, Mary pretty much drew a line in the sand and said, I've been holding on to all this stuff. And if you want it, you're taking it now, or it's going into an estate sale and it'll be gone. And thankfully at that point, the board had kind of changed direction in terms of thinking through how we would interpret the site moving forward, and accepted everything. And she actually facilitated the gifts from a number of other family members around the country at the same time in order to bring a large cache of objects to the museum. The importance of that, and then at the same time, we actually went through phase 1 of a major restoration project, which involved emptying the entire structure of its collection. So we realized that this was an opportunity to actually not put things back where they'd been. This was a disruption that we could take advantage of. And so we did, and installed a good number of, basically we now have 2 Cochran era bedrooms and a hallway upstairs. And it's allowed us, even though we don't own anything that belonged to anyone else who ever lived on the site, it's allowed us to completely reinterpret the entire structure because we can authentically talk about the Cochrans. It gives us some freedom to talk about the other individuals who have engaged with our site over time. And we do that in other places. So fast forwarding to today, we have become a much more vibrant place that is focused on bringing in our community, bringing in local Austinites. And we do that through programming that not only appeals to people who have a real love of history, but we do that through our Modern Times lecture series each year. But we recognize that historic places matter, but they don't necessarily matter to everyone for the same reasons. Not everybody wants an active history lesson. Some people want to come up and see art, and we've become a place where local artists have the ability to engage with the public, and it helps them, from a professional standpoint themselves. We've also gotten involved in theater, Hidden Room Theater and Ventana Ballet. We've actually had ballet in our site, which when we first considered it, I had a lot of trepidation about dancers amongst our collections, but it actually works great. And then we do a number of we do a number of rotating temporary exhibits each year and collaborate with other historical and arts organizations in Austin. From the standpoint of heritage tourists, we have been able to expand to a much more immersive experience that takes our visitors from our site's construction in 1856 up through the Great Depression. So focusing on the lived experience rather than on decorative art styles. And then more recently, we've been going through a really thoughtful and intentional rebalancing of our neighborhood narrative to do a better job of telling all of the stories connected to our site and not just the stories connected to the Neills and Cochrans. To that end, the big thing that has happened this year at the museum is a project called If These Walls Could Talk. And this project has encompassed an art exhibition, and you're seeing one of the installations from the show right here. It's called Horror Vacui. And all of the work on display is trompe l'oeil porcelain. So every element of that vacuum cleaner is made out of porcelain. So there's an art exhibition. There's an orientation as well as an art film, and then related performance pieces all connected to this show. It sees the museum as well as Austin history through the eyes of its two protagonists, who are named Clora and Ruby Virginia. And you see Clora's silhouette on the left in our logo and Ruby Virginia's on the right. And they are adolescent girls who confront our site's history with their eyes wide open, but with a real sense of hopefulness for the future. And really the idea here is that the more we talk to each other, the better we can chart a path forward that is more equitable for all. The collaborative team on this project is us, the museum, and I've been the primary connection point there. Ginger Geyer, who you see there on the left, who's a visual artist. She's the one who works in trompe l'oeil porcelain. And Jennifer Cumberbatch, who is an actor and storyteller. And they're holding Topsy-Turvy, which you see an image of that installation down on the bottom, so you can see it a little bit better. And that's really become the mascot, if you will, for the entire show. This Topsy-Turvy doll, which connects black and white within the same body structure. And I'm going to show you, this might be a little clunky, but we've produced a promo video that's about 2 minutes long that hopefully.
In 1860, in and around the city of Austin, there were a total of 6,000 people. 2,000 of those people were enslaved.
There hasn't, to this point, been an emphasis on the slaves and the slave artisans in this dwelling and the contribution that they made to a lasting legacy, even about the fact that the house is still standing.
I'd like to invite you to this exhibit to see the art in it, but also see the dialogue that's going on with the house.
My name is Rowena Houghton Dasch. I'm the executive director of the Neill-Cochran House Museum in Austin, Texas. The back of Austin, the backbone of Austin, was built through enslaved labor. The city functioned because of enslaved labor through the end of the Civil War. It's very easy to get disconnected from that history, and very few places can you actually learn about it today. And we actually have a site where you can walk in the places where those enslaved people once worked.
Part of what we're doing with this project is not just art and history, but it's modeling the kinds of relationships that we would like to see people have across ethnic boundaries, across political boundaries, across all kinds of boundaries.
We called it If These Walls Could Talk for a reason. There are a lot of stories embedded in here, I think, and many of them will never be known, but we're trying to kind of pull some out and give you a starter to take off with your own story. That's what would thrill me, is if you added to the stories that we've initiated.
We usually talk about deficit, and I want to talk about contribution. And this is one of the major contributions that enslaved artisans have made to our city.
Dasch, looking at that, I'm like, back when one could get a haircut. My hair looked so good in that video. So here's an installation shot of the dining room. And you saw that in the video as well. The center of the table actually has an installation on it. So this show has been, it's very difficult to explain. Essentially, we started out with Ginger, who's the porcelain artist, and we were going to mount a retrospective of her career. So it's about 30 years worth of artwork. And of course, not all of that artwork engages issues of race. And that really wasn't her focus all along. But then as she became more interested in our site history, and at the same time, it was really during the time we were working with her, getting going on this show, that we came to understand that not only was our two-story dependency a slave quarters, it's the only one. It's the only one that survives in the city. And so she really kind of latched onto that. And she started thinking about what this show could mean and how it could be more than just a disruption of our space, with contemporary art disrupting historic space. And that was, she was the one who actually brought Jennifer to the table. And that's when this really became not an art installation, it became a project. So some of the work does not connect to this overarching issue of racial equity across our city's history, but much of it does. Anyway, the dining room table, this is called Bodegon for Frito pie. And I'm sorry I don't have a close-up of it, but essentially we took this beautifully set Victorian table and threw a fondue pot into the middle of it with a bag of Fritos kind of spilling out over the tablecloth. And again, everything, including the individual Fritos, is made of porcelain. And in the melting pot, you have, you see the Statue of Liberty made out of Velveeta, who is melting into the pot while two pre-Columbian frogs are trying to jump out. And then there are references to Montezuma in here, the Virgin of Guadalupe. I mean, that all kind of shows up in various different aspects of the installation. And Ginger's point with it was really that this construct of the melting pot is one that hasn't been doing anybody any favors. And there has been, and certainly this has happened in Texas, a sense that anybody who comes from south of the border is just, they're one thing, they're Latin American. But there's this very rich and diverse cultural heritage that gets that goes away as a result in terms of our larger consciousness. And we really every one of us is unique, and eliding those differences doesn't really respect all of our cultural backgrounds. So that's what's going on in the middle of the dining room table. On the sideboard, there's an installation called Sharing Slices, and I think I've actually got a detail of that. That was produced, so a number of installations were produced for the show, including Sharing Slices, which you see there, these are all different kinds of pie. I'm not going to remember entirely, but it's key lime, sweet potato, pumpkin, apple, pecan, chocolate, cherry, and that may be all of them. And the idea is that we as Americans, what American doesn't love pie? Well, my daughter doesn't love pie, but she's odd that way. Most Americans love pie. We might love different kinds of pie. You might be a chicken pot pie person. You might be a shepherd's pie person, but that is a thing that we all carry with us. And so this is a way of showing our own individuality while at the same time recognizing that we are part of this larger cultural tradition. And that's why this show, I think, has been seen as so uplifting, powerful and uplifting, is because this really isn't about dividing anyone. It's about bringing everyone onto the same page together. As you can see, we allowed the show to be installed literally on top of our collection pieces. What you see on the top left, that sofa, is called Couch Potatoes Not. And it's various different images of workers from the art historical canon with a wood block, and these are porcelain pillows, right? But the image on the right is of George Washington Carver, who was really instrumental in agricultural development and helping to bring distressed fields that had been depleted of their natural resources through over cotton farming back to become meaningful agricultural areas. And so the couch potato, you've got the idea of somebody sitting on the couch and the pillows, but then you bring in George Washington Carver, who did work with potatoes, sweet potatoes specifically. And so Ginger's work has a lot of, there are a lot of puns embedded, some of which are more and some are less evident. The Cochran desk has been covered with a installation called Illuminated Manuscripts. These are all books that were written by people that Ginger knows, mostly in Austin. This is actually one of my favorite installations, are these bells that are hanging from our banister that it's called Campanile for Mary's Magnificat. And a lot of Ginger's work has religious symbolism embedded in it. And what she wasn't originally planning to put that installation in, but we have an Audubon print on the other wall, and she just kept staring at that print. And finally she said, can I add an installation? I want to hang these bells from the banister, because she figured the birds from the print would very much enjoy going and picking on the bird feeder, because those bells are essentially, there's kind of like those peanut butter bird feeders if they're covered in sunflower seeds. And then there has been this performance piece, which Jennifer has brought to the table. The image you see on the left is from a show called Rise and Shine, in which she takes on the persona of a shoe shine worker in Austin, and she basically imbues him with the gift of the omniscient narrator and the storyteller. And so she tells our site's history while she's shining someone's shoes. And this point right here, where everybody's standing, at a certain point in the show, she talks about the fact that the Hills, who were the ones who originally developed our site in 1856, ran out of money during the course of construction, and they never moved in. But in the context of attempting to finish this project, they sold 5 enslaved people. And she had everyone in the room stand to represent these people whose names we to this day don't know. And it was incredibly powerful. We did an event called Oratory Sunday. Both of those images on the right are based on that. The Cochrans, Bessie Cochran's father was the first Presbyterian minister in Williamson County, which is just to the north of Austin, in the 1870s. And our site has a deep connection with the Presbyterian Church. And so she actually had actors come and read for Henry Bates Rose, who's Bessie Cochran's father, and then Jacob Fontaine, who was one of the, really was the preeminent African-American pastor in Austin after the Civil War. And so this whole group had come together to be a part of that event. This has been, I think that may be, finally, and I know I need to stop because we're getting on in time. This summer we participated, we put on a self-paced driving tour of Black West Austin, starting at our site and then moving through areas around us. You can see 1 and 2 on this map. We're 1, 2 is right across the street from us. And then these were where the rest of the sites were. The whole thing was within about a 3-mile radius. And what I would say is that whenever we're working on anything new, any programming, the thing we ask ourselves is, why us? Why would you come here to learn this? And how can we connect that to our own site history? And in this instance, as I say, we are home to the only slave quarters standing in the city of Austin. And we are in an area that once was quite integrated and was essentially forcibly segregated in the late 1920s. And so we have the ability, because of the authentic fabric of our site, to be a leader in the conversations that are happening right now in Austin about what a better future is going to look like. And it's been really gratifying to be a part of it. We've gotten great response, and I think I will leave you with, Jen's statement that so often we talk about deficit rather than talking about contribution. And I think if we focus more on talking about contribution, that's the positive. And it has left us here, at least, in a really good place. So I will leave it there and take questions.
Okay.
Rowena,
Yes.
what aspects after all of the exhibitions and people that have come, what have you thought has been most rewarding from this event?
So right at the very beginning, this man came through and he was visiting from, I think, New Hampshire, but he'd grown up in Austin in the early 60s. And his dad was a law professor at UT. And he'd had a guided tour, which sadly, so we've extended this show. The show will now close on November 22nd. We were able to, the lenders all agreed to extend their loans because of COVID. Anyway, but this was that last spring. And he said, my dad was, in 1961, a number of Black UT students approached his father to help them with their argument for integrating the dorms at UT, which were at that time segregated. And they, with the help of this faculty member, invited Martin Luther King to come to UT. And he was, this guy who I was talking to was about 13 at the time. And he went with his father when MLK spoke. And then he was actually in the room when Dr. King spoke with these students. And so there was a private conversation. This 13-year-old boy, his dad said, sit there with a book. And so he was a fly on the wall. And he said, and he was Jewish too. And it was, the whole conversation was fascinating. But he said that he was visiting Austin now, and his friends had told him he needed to come see the show. And what he said was, he said, back in the 1960s, not only no institution would have been talking about slavery in Austin in the 1850s. Nobody wanted to talk about that. And he said, and the idea that I could come to a antebellum mansion and these issues would be, he choked up and he just said, I can't even articulate how much it means to me to be able to come back to Austin, and having had the experience I had as a kid, seeing where the city is today. And so that to me was one of the most powerful moments we've had with the show. The other thing I would say is Jen's performance, the Rise and Shine performance, which I think, Gray, maybe you were able to attend that one. It was just so powerful, and being in this place where finally we're articulating topics that just have been forbidden, not at the Neill-Cochran House Museum specifically, but in Austin. I mean, I'm sure you all have heard that, keep Austin weird, and we're wildly progressive, and liberal bubble and all of this, but that has actually allowed the city to cover over some real injustices. And I don't think that the city really deserves in a lot of ways, the reputation it has. I think there's a lot of, I think people would like to think that we're more inclusive than we are. So to be able to be a part of that has been really, really special.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have more of a history related question, but also concerning the lives of African Americans in Austin. Do you know much about any of the enslaved individuals who are associated with the property?
So unfortunately, as I say, those 5 individuals who are sold were not named. We know it happened, but they were not named. The first occupants of the property, because the Hills didn't move in, were the students and teachers for the State School for the Blind while they were waiting for their own building to be built. And because that was a state institution, the state has archives, and the state actually kept records. And we know of, oh gosh, it's 4 or 5 individuals who were leased to the state to work at the site. Some of them were named, some of them are simply listed as woman owned by Colonel Hubbard, whatever. In some cases we know more, and some we know less. We know far less than we would like to. The one name that we've learned over the past few months that is just thinking about this boy is, I feel like you could write a book about him. His name was Lamb, and he was 9 years old, and he was enslaved by, I can't remember whom, but leased for a month in order to come teach and the school for the blind was segregated, right? So this was the white school for the blind. Ultimately, there was also a black school for the blind. But anyway, so he was brought in to teach these white blind children how to do basketry. And one of the goals of the school was to make it possible for the students there to go on and lead meaningful lives and to teach them skills. And so you have this enslaved boy sent in to teach others a skill that would theoretically allow them to lead a meaningful life and find gainful employment, when the one teaching them never was going to have that opportunity. And I say never, I mean, the Civil War came and slavery ended, but in 1858, that was not a foregone conclusion. So he's someone that we really can begin to build a picture of, because we do know his name and we know why he was there. After the School for the Blind left, things were really chaotic. We know very little about the lieutenant governor lived on site during the Civil War. His name was Fletcher Stockdale. But for whatever reason, he is a relatively unknown individual, even to people who study Texas politics. So we know very little about his household, unfortunately. And then of course, after that point, the war was over. And so historically, I think one of the reasons that the Neill-Cochran House Museum never really engaged in these topics is because our time horizon was very short, right? 1856 to 1865. And because the original family never moved in. I mean, there's so much we don't know. And there's so much we did know about the Neills and the Cochrans that really, from the standpoint of interpretation, the interpretation at the site really went from 1876 to about 1930. We ignored the first 20 years from a habitation standpoint because there was so little that we did know. So I think that's why it wasn't an active, desire to bury history. It's just that the history we had was so incomplete that, focusing on it from a visitor standpoint, it's like, well, we don't know this and we don't know that. And you end up sharing ignorance rather than,
yeah, and that kind of leads into, sort of what happens in Austin during Reconstruction, and then the end of Reconstruction. What happened. We know kind of what happened in Charleston and other southern cities, but
Sure.
formerly slaveholding cities. Was there a similar trajectory in Austin, or?
Well, it's interesting. Texas had a real explosion, I guess you might call it, of freedom colonies in the years after the end of the Civil War. And what I was unaware of was how unusual that was. And certainly such freedom colonies did develop in other places. But apparently Texas saw more of them than other areas. And I think there are a variety of reasons for that. But Austin actually saw the establishment of 13 different freedmen communities or freedom colonies after the end of the war. Beginning, the earliest was, I think, probably Wheatville, which is literally across the street from us. So that's another component to our narrative. But it was established in 1867. Clarksville, which is 2 or 3 miles from us, and that was the kind of the ultimate destination of that driving tour, was established in 1871. So what you had in the Austin, Travis County was one of 3 counties to vote against secession in 1861. Now that ends up being part of this sort of false progressive narrative, because at the same time Travis County is voting against secession, 1/3 of the population is enslaved. So it's not like there was a real abolitionist movement in Austin, but I do think there was a certain sense here that was a little less directly antagonistic. You end up, there's not as much written about urban slavery as about rural slavery. That is a developing topic. I've actually just been reading the book that the Owens Thomas House, their collection of essays, and I can't remember the name of it, but Slavery in Savannah, something like that. And it's a very good kind of introduction to urban enslavement. But one of the issues there was that you didn't have quite as much of a, there wasn't quite as much headbutting. The agricultural industry really involved backbreaking labor and a real imbalance in terms of the Black population, the white population. And in urban communities, I'm not going to say that I don't want to make a value judgment, but I do think that Austin became a place that people felt like they could come together into communities and work in the city or work in outlying areas and feel some protection. And so I think that's part of the reason why so many people gravitated towards Austin after the war. But we did have a sizable number of people came to Austin. Black people came to Austin after the end of the war. We are today the only major growing metropolitan area in the country that is losing its Black population. So you saw this growth in the years after the Civil War, and then with the imposition of Jim Crow laws and increasing inequities, particularly as you get to into the 20th century, then you start seeing that population decline. So the population decline really starts kind of in the 1910s and goes from there. So I don't know if I answered that question very well, but.
Because one of my questions was actually going to be, what kind of, when the house was built, it was a suburban estate.
Yes.
And then what is the neighborhood around it like now?
I should be wearing my T-shirt. The museum T-shirt says Neill-Cochran House Museum, established 1856, not a frat house.
Okay.
we are just to the west of the UT campus today. We're about a 10-minute walk from the west side of campus. That map that I showed, that 1887 map, the only reason we're on there is that with the establishment of UT had a tract of land and they built on the west side of it, but they owned the east side. And so that was just kind of open well, grazing space essentially, but available for future development, right? So nobody could build on it because the university owned it. But the area to the west of that, so they built on the west side, the area to the west of that was available for purchase. And so a neighborhood of, and when the university first opened, they had no housing. So students and faculty who were coming to Austin needed someplace to live. So what has become our neighborhood really began after the establishment of UT in 1883. So that map in 1887 is really showing a paradigm shift for the city of Austin in terms of the direction of development. Today, we've got, lots of multi-story buildings, dorm buildings and stuff to the east of us. So where you see those blue dots all through this area is student housing. To the behind us, you still have some single family homes that are being encroached upon by people who are trying to build stealth dorms and things like that. Yeah, you might be able to see in the satellite view. So there we are. So you can see all of those big box things. Those are all dorms. But behind us, going back to the west, you see smaller structures.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, my daughter went to UT and she lived up on like 34th and Guadalupe. Yeah, I just thought
I live at 32nd and Guadalupe. Yeah.
So now I have please, if anybody else has questions, please type them into the chat. I was going to ask you a question that goes in a different direction now. I read something on your website that kind of intrigued me about preservation, that when the house was used as a federal hospital, the quarantine soldiers really damaged it extensively, but that was helpful to you because you were able to get some original look to the house because of the damage they did. I don't know if you can.
No, because that happened in 1865 and 1866. So it had been repaired by the point the house became a museum. We do know the extent of the damage because it's documented in a letter. But yes, so actually I was talking to somebody about this several weeks ago. There are these stories that at some point in a previous restoration, somebody found a bullet hole, like a bullet embedded in one of the mantelpieces. And God knows where that's gone. And I've never seen photo evidence of it or anything. But back in the 70s, apparently they did find some evidence of what that letter was describing. The house is Abner Cook, the master builder's most intact site, partly because it was built of limestone rubble. So it really protected itself against alteration. I do think probably the fact that it was built the way it was is the reason it's still standing, because that level of damage to a frame structure after the war probably would have just been taken down, but it was more trouble to take this place down than it was to fix it back up again. From a restoration standpoint, the thing we did, we were, because of all of this construction in the West Campus area, and all those heavy trucks, and frankly, they're dynamiting because we're on bedrock, and they're dynamiting down in order to build parking and whatever else. So we ended up with some severe differential movement on our site, and our structural beams, the lintels above all of our windows and doorways had ceased to function structurally. And so we had to go in and reinforce at basically every window and door with steel beams. That is what really allowed us to kind of understand better how the site was constructed. In our rotating exhibit space upstairs, we have an exposed cedar lintel so that you can see what was originally put in there. It's still there. It's just it's got steel underneath it. And then we also left a kind of a broken wall where you can see the stone wall and then the broken plaster. Our walls inside were plastered. It's true plaster, same stuff that Renaissance artists used to make frescoes. And so you can see what that true plaster looks like, the depth of it and the way the surface get, you've got a surface that's probably 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters thick. That is what you would end up painting on if you were painting a fresco. So all of that remains exposed, and that's because of the differential movement. But what the soldiers did to us, they did so long ago that, it doesn't have much impact today.
When did the National Society of Colonial Dames in Texas acquire the house?
1958. They acquired it from the last member of the Cochran family still living in the home, Frankie Cochran Hill. And Frankie's niece, Mary Cochran Bowles, is the Mary I was talking about. And she was born in, she was a baby in the house in the late 1920s, and remains our closest connection to that first generation of history. I mean, she's not the first generation, but at least she knew them.
Are there any questions?
I said too much.
Very interesting.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Mimi, I'm hoping I'm going to see you when you come to Austin.
I think you will. I thank Eileen for getting that lined up.
Rowena,
Yes.
I have one question. I think I've unmuted myself to ask this. Actually, I couldn't operate the typing thing. The people who are dressed up in your video, who are the first person interpreters, I guess, first person history, what artisans were they?
So they are actually related to a film called, I think the name of it's actually, this is the thing that it got completely delayed by COVID because the actors were unable to complete the filming because they couldn't be near each other. But now it's done. And so we'll have it for the finale for the show next month. But it's called The House That Slaves Built. And they are a combination of masons. So the people who actually built the home, but then several of the people who are shown there are actually are stand-ins for the people who were sold. So that this film is actually going to go through the sale. And of course, this is an artist's rendering because there's so much we don't know. But this film will kind of cast our site in a different way that we hope will really bring to life the slave quarters building for visitors. But we do not actually do first person interpreters. We don't do that.
Okay.
That's what so they were part of the project. If you're interested in If These Walls Could Talk, if you go to our website, there is a virtual tour that takes you through the site, but with a focus on the objects. And when COVID hit, we actually added to that virtual tour the audio tour, which is narrated by the artist. So when you're looking around, you have the ability to hear what Ginger has to say about the installations. And that, as I say, that is connected to our website. It's not like seeing it in person, but it's the next best thing. Yeah, Alan, if you go to, I think it's Explore. It's either Explore or Exhibits. Or it's either Explore or Visit. I can't ever remember. Yeah, go to Exhibits and then If These Walls Could Talk. You gotta click on the, yep. Keep going down, you'll get to there. Take a virtual tour of the exhibit.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing you got to know about this is like when you get onto it, she's going to start talking. And so you have to punch the microphone if you don't want to hear her. Which, normally it's not an issue, but when you're trying to talk, then she talks over you. Anything else I can answer?
Any other questions?
Well, I appreciate everybody tuning in. If you find yourselves in Austin, please come visit us. We are open despite COVID. That's something I didn't say anything about, but we upgraded our air filters. We've got hand sanitizer everywhere. We've enabled touchless ticketing, so you can buy your tickets ahead of time. We're only allowing one group in every 15 minutes in order to keep groups distant from one another. We feel really pretty good about it. We've even been able to do some outdoor events because we've got pretty spacious grounds, and so we can ensure social distancing outside. And so I would not say we're business as usual, but we're business as best we can be right now.
I think that's the best way to put it. Is business as best we can be.
I mean, we're just happy that we can be open and that we can be a resource for people who are looking for something to do. Because right now it's pretty frustrating. If you're traveling, there's not too much you can engage with.
My daughter still lives in Austin, so.
Oh yeah, we'll send her by.
We will come by and visit next time. We were supposed to go out in April, but then obviously couldn't. So next time we're out there, we'll come see.
Oh, please do.
Thank you, Rowena. That was great.
Oh, thank you. I hope everybody has a great rest of your day.
Thank you for your time. That was wonderful.
Sure.